Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. College football playoff games quickly approaching. Want to take another deep dive into this Alabama-Michigan matchup. Talk about a few keys for this Alabama program to get the win over Michigan. Really excited to get into this one. This is an Alabama team that a completely different team than we saw week 2, week 3 to what we just saw in the SEC championship game. And Nick Saban has a long list of impressive coaching years. This one might be at the top. I mean, he took a team that kind of looked dead in the water after that USF game, and now you're talking about Alabama competing for a national championship. Really excited to get into this one. Before we do, just want to say thank you to you guys. It's been a blast all year breaking down these games. The amount of support you guys have shown the boys has been amazing. Cannot thank you guys enough. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and more importantly, would love to hear from you guys in the comment sections. Your keys for Alabama to knock off Michigan. Dill, going to kick this one off to you. Alabama, Michigan, how we feeling?
And when you talk about improvement for this Alabama team, it starts and stops with this offensive line. Because as they've started to figure it out and being able to impose their will a little bit more, kind of culminating with that performance against Georgia that I thought was very dominant for a good chunk of that game, frankly. That's allowed this team to open. It just like taking a lot of pressure off of Jalen Milroe, who, again, is not Bryce Young. I don't think you want the whole game, the whole outcome resting on his shoulders. But as he's kind of been able to play a little more complementary football, along with the ability to run the ball and be physical up front, this Alabama team is night and day different.
I think the story, yes, Jalen Milroe has taken some massive steps in terms of his confidence, in terms of his play. I think a large majority of that has done with, Alabama's offensive line in the beginning of the season was largely a liability. It was a problem. And now you look at this Alabama offensive line coming off that SEC championship game, you're looking at one of the best units that we see across the country. So you look at the first key for Alabama to knock off Michigan, it's winning at the point of attack. It's winning along the line of scrimmage. This is a Michigan team that has not faced an opponent that's better than them up front. This is the best offensive line. I think the way Alabama's offensive line is playing, it's the best offensive line Michigan has seen all year. Can you win the line of scrimmage and force Michigan into a spot where they haven't been all year? And that is maybe having to allocate some more bodies into the box and maybe doing some different things to manufacture pressure, because Michigan largely through the first 13 weeks of the season hasn't had to do that yet.
Well, they've been able to play essentially a two high safety and a nickel defense pretty much throughout the whole year. And again, they've been able to stop the run against teams like Penn State and Ohio State and Maryland. And some of these teams they've played that have good offenses, they've been able to stop it with their 6-7 man box. And with that, they've really been able to limit the big plays, which is obviously a huge part of Alabama's game. A lot of their scores come off of those, and Jalen Milroe very comfortable throwing that deep ball. So to me, if Alabama can kind of force Michigan into using safeties to stop the run and keep them out of those positions, I don't think the corners really have been forced to deal with that, being able to just play one-on-one defense down the field. I think Maryland was able to take a little bit of advantage of that at times. In Alabama is as good as it gets, I think, getting downfield with Burton and Bond and some of these other guys.
That's what I'm most looking for, and I think that's what Nick Saban and this offensive coaching staff is looking for. Seeing if you can get Michigan out of that base defense, out of the defense that they've had the most success with. That's with a nickel and two high safeties. And if you can,
if they can sit in that defense, it also creates the possibility of turnovers, because Michigan's done a very good job with that, with their safeties and Mike Sanders still in that nickel role, being able to read defenses and get their hands on footballs and take it away. And obviously, at least at the beginning of the season, that was something Milroe struggled with, was seeing guys coming or being able to read defenses and seeing where the defenders were and where they could take the football.
And we don't know what Michigan's defense looks like when they're not winning the line of scrimmage. So that's what you're if you're an Alabama fan, that's what you're looking for. That's what Tommy Rees and Nick Saban are looking for, is, hey, if we start running the football and winning up front, and Michigan needs to roll in a safety or maybe even just take their nickel off the field, add a third linebacker, what's that defense going to look like? And as Michigan fans who've watched every single week of Michigan football, we haven't seen that yet. So I'm excited to see if Alabama can get Michigan kind of away from that base defense. The next key I'm looking for here is staying on schedule. And I think this is a massive storyline for a lot of teams in football games, kind of stating the obvious, but more specifically for Alabama, because you look at where Jalen Milroe struggles the most. When they're in those third and long situations, where defenses are able to kind of play that soft zone coverage, keep their eyes on Jalen Milroe, crunch down on those throwing windows. That's where Jalen Milroe is probably his least comfortable, right? Processing the field, staying in the pocket, and trying to deliver strikes against zone coverage. If Alabama struggles to stay on schedule and is forced into a lot of those third and longs, that's going to be a problem. So if you're Alabama, you're trying to run the football, stay on schedule, and when you're facing those third and short situations, the whole playbook's open, right? You got one of the most dynamic, athletic quarterbacks who can run the football. You got guys like Isaiah Bond who can work those short, intermediate route trees extremely well. If you're looking at Alabama, keys to the game, staying on schedule, staying in third manageable, top of the priority list for them.
And that's been another thing they've improved. And you talk about like what Tommy Rees has done to kind of make Jalen Milroe more comfortable is they've started to use their running backs in the pass game. They've started to use their slot receivers in those shorter parts of the field. And Isaiah Bond, I mean, just a very versatile player. He's been really, I thought against Georgia, he did a really good job working underneath. He obviously can get downfield. You look at some of the like other games like Texas A&M, but a guy who's very versatile. And I like how they're starting to use him because again, Jalen Milroe, I think he does miss too many of those intermediate passes, like those 8 to 15 yards maybe type passes.
Or even shorter at times. Like that's
100%. And that's a big part of them staying on schedule is him being able to complete those passes because he's gotten better about it for sure. But again, when you see it not happening, that's when things kind of get into a tailspin.
I 100% agree. When Alabama's offense is struggling, it's those on schedule plays where they're missing some easy throws and then not
running the football. It's like those two things when they don't run the football and Jalen Milroe isn't making those easy throws. Things can get a little hairy because again, all of that predicates setting up the deep ball, which is ultimately what Alabama likes to score.
That's how I mean, you talk about keys for Michigan, and we'll do a separate video on that. It's not good. It's making Alabama consistently make those throws. And for Alabama, key to the game is consistently making those throws and staying on schedule. Last thing for Alabama's offense first is using Jalen Milroe and his legs. And we all know Jalen Milroe extremely capable of it. I mean, one of the most dynamic quarterbacks in the country with the football in his hands. Alabama, in a very similar way, Michigan hasn't had to use JJ's legs, not necessarily needing to use Jalen Milroe's legs in all of their games. You want to keep Jalen Milroe healthy. If we don't need to run him 15 times a game, we're not going to. But in this game where it's win or go home, I mean, Jalen Milroe using his legs needs to be a priority. And again, when you talk about making Jalen Milroe the most comfortable, when he's an athlete running with the football, you can tell he's extremely comfortable doing so.
And they need to at least have the threat of it because you go back to the beginning of the year, it just felt like he was too slow to kind of take off.
He didn't want to. He was like hesitant to do so. He wanted to be a pocket passer where I think Tommy Rees, sorry to cut you off here, looked at this offense and looked at Jalen Milroe and kind of had that conversation saying, you need to utilize the skill sets that you have. And if that's running the football, that's running the football. And through the second half of the year, you've seen Jalen Milroe much more receptive and willing to break the pocket and be an athlete.
And it's been twofold, not only in the pass and scrambles, which obviously has hurt a lot of teams, but even getting into some more designed runs. I think all of it together, they've started to put more emphasis on his legs. He's so dynamic. I don't know why you wouldn't. And in this type of game, like, yeah, you're right. Like, it's time to burn the boats. There is no more saving guys. You run the absolute best offense you can run. And I think a lot of that is being able to put the defense in conflict. And they didn't necessarily use Jalen Milroe's legs a ton against Georgia, but you saw the threat of it was clearly impacted that football game where they were spying 2, they were rushing 3 at times. It took a lot of heat off of that pass protection unit that obviously in their own right has had some inconsistencies, gotten better, but has been inconsistent. You just see how much more difficult it is to prepare for a defense or for this offense when the clear present threat of him running and being in the read option, all of it just makes this defense. And frankly, Michigan hasn't seen anything like what Jalen Milroe has.
That is for sure. There's not another Jalen Milroe. And I think you said it best. It's not necessarily always using Jalen Milroe using his legs, but it's, I mean, having that threat where you saw Georgia completely fundamentally change how they wanted to play defense, spying with 2 players. I mean, that's okay. If Michigan's going to do that, then maybe Jalen Milroe is not necessarily using his legs, but that's going to set stuff up in the intermediate passing attack when you're taking 2 guys that should be dropping back in coverage and they're just focusing on Jalen Milroe. So kind of depends on how Michigan decides to try to stop Jalen Milroe. And if you see the 2 spies, then you're probably not using him that much. But if they're not going to spy him or they're only going to have one guy spy, like that's when you want Jalen Milroe going out, being an athlete. Now, moving to the defense, I think the biggest mismatch, and maybe in this entire football game, is the wide receivers for Michigan going against this Alabama cornerback room that I think is the best in all of college football. I mean, you're looking at Kool-Aid McKinstry, Terry and Arnold, 2 first-round NFL draft picks. And then you look at Michigan wide receivers, and, I mean, Michigan doesn't have a lot of holes in this roster. If there is a quote-unquote hole or at least a position group that is probably not up to the rest of the Michigan team, it's probably that wide receiver. And so if you're Alabama, you're saying, yeah, we're going to play man coverage. We're going to put a safety down in the box. We're going to stop this run game and force J.J. McCarthy and these wide receivers to make it happen. And can Cornelius Johnson and Roman Wilson for Michigan separate on a guy like Kool-Aid or Terry and Arnold? I think Alabama likes how that might play out.
And when you can stop Michigan's run game, you can just really put a lot of pressure on this offense. Because it's no secret. I mean, that's been what Michigan's wanted to do now for 3 years. It starts and stops with running the ball physically in between the tackles. Again, you kind of talk like I think Alabama does probably have the luxury to, maybe as much an extent as anybody, of being able to put their corners on islands and say, okay, fine, go beat us. If you can beat us doing it, Michigan, go do your thing. But I'm kind of with you. That's the one matchup I think certainly as Michigan fans you're looking at and being like, that's the concern. Because again, Alabama has been really good on defense. They've given up a couple big plays here and there over the course of the year. And with Michigan's offense, like, do they have that Evan Stewart? Do they have that Malik Neighbors or Brian? Like those type of, can Roman Wilson give that to them? That'll be a huge question that I think Michigan's going to have to try to answer.
And this is not me saying the narrative is JJ can't win there's a narrative across college football that JJ McCarthy is not capable of doing that. He certainly is. Like, there's a reason JJ McCarthy is going to be a first-round NFL draft pick. I'm more questioning the receivers. Like, the receivers got to get open against the cornerbacks. And you take a look at Kool-Aid McKinstry versus Cornelius Johnson or Terry Arnold versus Roman Wilson. I think even Michigan fans know
you go to that Ohio State game. I mean, they tried to take their shot down the field once or twice, but you just saw how tight the coverage was and how little space there was downfield. I mean, they had to kind of try to find alternate ways of doing it. And that's probably the only other secondary that maybe Penn State, but they didn't hit any deep shots against Penn State either. Those are the secondaries that really could challenge Michigan's wide receivers like Alabama, I think, could. And you just didn't see a ton of explosive plays doing it.
And when you can be confident with your cornerback sitting on islands and go walk in some safeties in the box, like, that's probably what Alabama is going to be looking to do. Now, another thing that Alabama needs to make sure happens is dealing with J.J. McCarthy and his legs. Like, when Alabama has struggled on defense, it's been with the quarterbacks that can extend plays, use their legs in some designed running plays. And we just talked about Jalen Milroe kind of burning the boats and letting your quarterbacks go be athletes with the football. Michigan's going to look to do the same thing with J.J. And so,
I mean, I'm sure they looked at that Auburn film and said, all right, look, this is how the ground attack worked. They did a really good job. In Auburn, again, they've done it all year kind of. They do a good job of putting your linebackers, especially in conflict. And I didn't think that was the best I've seen Jahad Campbell and Deontay Lawson play football. Looking at this game, they're going to have a month or so to prepare for it. And I think Michigan's going to be looking at the same thing. Like, all right, what has hurt Alabama's defense? It's been running quarterbacks. I think Jaden Daniels was able to do it, scrambling a little bit more. And you saw Peyton Thorne do it in more of that designed run. So I would think Michigan's going to come with a little bit of it. It will be if Alabama's defensive staff can kind of rally it together. And
they certainly have the capability. Like Jahad Campbell, Deontay Lawson, like those guys are capable of dealing with
that.
Yeah, they got the athleticism to do so. So now it's just from a schematic standpoint, what are you doing to deal with J.J. McCarthy? Last thing I want to talk about real quick is, as a Michigan fan, like, if there's one thing I'm a little concerned about in this matchup with Michigan's offense versus Alabama defense, it is the pass rush. Like, when Michigan's seen elite edge rushers, especially with Zach Zinter going down and kicking Carson into guard, like Chop Robinson, Adissa Isaac, those guys got after Michigan's tackles a little bit in pass protection. This is probably the next best group of edge rushers that Michigan would have seen in Dallas Turner and Chris Braswell. What is Michigan doing to stop this Alabama edge rushing? And can Alabama, Dallas Turner, Chris Braswell get after these Michigan tackles when they've shown that when going up against elite NFL talent, they've been a little susceptible to that pass rush.
And frankly, if they can stop the rushing attack, and that's again why it's so important for them to do it. Because if they can do it, that pass rush is going to be a huge problem. That's a big reason I think why that offensive line for Michigan hasn't maybe been exposed a little more on the edges. They've just been able to run the ball, keep the defensive ends kind of playing the run first, and then going to the pass second. And when they can't get out and use their athleticism the same way you saw like Isaac and Chop Robinson doing against Penn State, Michigan's got a pretty good job. Like they don't give up a ton of internal pressure or any of that other stuff. It's really predicated on defensive ends being able to key in on
100%. If there's a weakness in this Michigan offensive line, it's the offensive tackle play. It's not as a Michigan fans aren't worried about the interior as much as we're looking at. And that's not to say Alabama's got some dudes up front on the inside, but
that's where Michigan
this tackle position and protecting JJ McCarthy. You said it best. If Michigan struggles to run the football and is in some of those third and long situations, and Dallas Turner, Chris Braswell pinning their ears back in obvious passing situations, certainly could be a problem.
They're just too good of it's the speed thing. It's not really anything else. It's can the Michigan tackles get off the football and catch up with these guys who, again, especially Dallas Turner. His quickness off the ball, it's that like a next level where you can just kind of run by a guy untouched. And again, you look back to that Penn State game, there were too many instances of that type of look, and Dallas Turner is as good as they've seen. So if they can put Michigan in those moments, again, Michigan hasn't been in it a ton in the last 3 years because they've been able to run the football really well. But if Alabama can kind of do what you said, be able to just kind of go one-on-one and put their corners on islands and say, all right, beat us, we'll stop the run. That I'm convinced that's with you. That would really put Michigan in a tough spot.
Yeah, 100% agree. Those are the matchups that if you're an Alabama fan, you're looking at this game and saying that's how we're winning this football game. We'll come back, talk about it in a very similar manner from the Michigan point of view, talking about what Michigan needs to do. Alabama fans, y'all can check that out if you want, or just not check it out. Focus on how Alabama's going to win this game. Regardless, appreciate you guys rocking with the boys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.